Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We've got this stack of source material right here, all focused on one really big event, the Bitcoin Conference 2025.
Mm.
Our mission today is basically to dive into these sources and, pull out the key insights, maybe the surprising moments, and what really seemed to matter from this huge gathering based purely on the information you shared.
That's right. And the sources, they really set the scene quickly. This wasn't some small meetup. They described the conference May 27th to 29th, 2025 in Vegas as just massive.
Massive how, like numbers-wise.
Yeah, huge numbers. Over 30,000 attendees, 500 speakers, 300 exhibitors. A really significant event put on by Bitcoin Magazine and BTC Inc.
Got it. And straight away, the source material seems to frame this particular conference. It calls it a historic moment for the whole sector.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get into it. Based on these sources, what was the overall, feeling or significance?
Well, what really stood out is how the sources positioned it. They didn't just say it was big. They called it the world's premier gathering for the Bitcoin community.
Okay, premier gathering.
Yeah. So presented as the central stage for major announcements, deep technical talks and really critical policy discussions.
And were there sort of overarching themes that kept popping up in the source coverage?
Absolutely. Two big pillars were hit again and again throughout the
Yeah.
reporting. Scalability, which is basically, how Bitcoin can handle way more transactions, and global Bitcoin adoption.
Okay, scalability and global adoption sounds pretty fundamental. Let's jump into what the sources are calling out as the biggest highlights then. And one thing that really grabbed my attention in the write-up was the political presence.
Right. And this is where, according to the sources, things got particularly interesting. They noted this unprecedented level of high-profile political figures showing up, specifically pointing to U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance.
Wow, the vice president.
Yeah.
That's pretty major for a Bitcoin conference. What did the sources capture from what he actually said?
So in his keynote, the sources reported Vance declared, and this is apparently a direct quote from their reporting, that cryptocurrencies finally have a champion and ally in the White House.
A champion and ally.
Yeah, and he specifically emphasized the Trump administration's support for the whole Bitcoin ecosystem.
That's strong language.
Yeah.
Did the sources detail any concrete policy moves or announcements tied to this support?
Yes, they did. A really landmark announcement discussed was an executive order signed earlier that year, back on March 6th, 2025.
Okay, and what was the purpose?
The purpose: to implement a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S. government.
A government Bitcoin reserve.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources, they really framed this as a radical shift,
Mhm.
signaling Bitcoin moving towards being seen as a strategic national asset.
Wow. Okay. And did they say anything about what the plan is for that reserve? Are they going to trade it or just hold it?
They did mention that a clear intention was stated not to sell the Bitcoin the U.S. government holds.
Just hold. Interesting. In fact, the sources even quoted President Trump's executive director, actually referring to Bitcoin as the gold standard in this whole context.
The gold standard. Okay.
Yes.
So we're seeing these significant political signals. What about the corporate world? Did the sources highlight any major institutional or corporate moves happening at the conference?
Oh, absolutely. A moment the sources specifically called out was Trump Media's announcement. They announced a massive $25 billion investment into Bitcoin.
Wait, $25 billion with a B.
Billion, yeah.
How did the reporting sort of interpret an investment of that size?
The sources described it as an emphatic signal. A really strong sign that major companies aren't just dipping their toes in anymore, they're actively jumping into the market.
Wait.
And they noted this investment really reinforces that narrative we were just talking about, Bitcoin being treated as a strategic asset, not just, some speculative bet.
So you've got these high-level political figures, massive corporate investments, all pointing towards some kind of shift. But it wasn't just headlines, right? The sources also talked about the tech side.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The technical tracks really dug into scaling Bitcoin. A lot of the discussions centered on layer 2 technologies.
Layer 2, okay.
Yeah, particularly things called roll-ups. These are basically solutions designed to handle a high volume of transactions more efficiently, sort of off the main Bitcoin blockchain, before settling them back.
And what kind of impact were these solutions having, according to the sources?
Well, the reporting highlighted that these scaling efforts are actually succeeding in driving transaction fees down below $1.
Below $1, that's a big deal.
Yeah, a huge deal for making smaller everyday transactions practical on Bitcoin.
Were there other tech topics creating buzz that the sources mentioned?
Discussions were also apparently pretty prominent around tokenized treasuries and bonds.
So putting traditional assets on the blockchain.
Exactly, representing those on-chain. The sources noted those ideas were gaining momentum. And there was also talk about blockchain interoperability, how different blockchains can work together, especially within frameworks that are designed to be regulation compliant.
And I think I saw the sources mention a more hands-on tech element too.
Right, yeah. They highlighted the official hackathon. It was partnered with Bitcoin Rec.
Okay.
And this basically brought developers together, actively building and showing off projects aimed at improving and expanding the Bitcoin ecosystem. So it shows that innovation happening, under the hood.
Right, that active building. And that kind of leads nicely into the regulatory side of things, which the sources seem to emphasize was a really central theme.
Regulation was definitely a major focus, yeah. Panels covered a whole range of topics, things like discussions on potential on-chain reserve regulations.
How reserves are managed on the blockchain itself.
Kinda, yeah. Like how reserves held by financial institutions might be verified or tracked on-chain, and also the ongoing push for clear stablecoin legislation.
What kind of perspectives did some of the speakers share on this whole regulatory front?
Well, the sources highlighted speakers like Senator Marsha Blackburn. She apparently emphasized preserving financial freedom and the individual right to self-custody digital assets.
Meaning holding your own keys, not using a custodian.
Exactly. Holding your own private keys rather than relying on, say, a bank or an exchange.
Gotcha. And beyond just U.S. policy, did the sources touch on Bitcoin's role globally?
Absolutely. There was a significant exploration of Bitcoin's role around the world, specific attention paid to adoption efforts and policy discussions in places like Africa and Asia.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, the sources mention this momentum by pointing to events like the Africa Bitcoin Conference and also the upcoming Bitcoin Asia 2025, which is set for Hong Kong.
Okay. So with all these different discussions happening, tech, policy, global stuff, who were some of the standout voices the sources pointed to, maybe beyond the politicians we already mentioned?
The sources listed several key figures. Michael Saylor, for instance, he was noted for, reiterating his very bullish vision.
He's known for that. Did they mention specifics?
Yeah, predicting Bitcoin reaching a $280 trillion market cap by 2045.
Wow, okay. That's optimistic. Who else did the sources feature?
Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss were mentioned. Their discussion was apparently on the importance of building secure, reliable platforms needed for, mass adoption.
Makes sense.
David Bailey, he's from BTC Inc., the organizer. He was highlighted for talking about the conference's specific role in driving global hyper-Bitcoinization.
That idea of Bitcoin becoming the world's main currency.
That's the one. And then there were some figures maybe from slightly outside the core crypto world.
Like who?
Well, Vivek Ramaswamy was noted for connecting Bitcoin to broader themes like economic freedom and individual responsibility. And Eric Trump was highlighted too.
Interesting. In what context?
As having emerged as a leading voice exploring how traditional finance could integrate with all this digital innovation.
Okay, so pulling all this together then, what was the main narrative or the biggest takeaway the sources seemed to really emphasize from this whole conference?
The sources were actually very clear on this. The overarching theme, they said, was Bitcoin's fundamental transition.
Transitioning from what to what?
From being seen primarily as, a speculative asset, something you gamble on, to being firmly established as a strategic store of value. The conference really marked that shift, according to the reporting.
And did the sources give any, market context around the time of the conference to sort of back up that sentiment?
They did, yeah. The reporting noted that as of the final day, May 29th, 2025, the Bitcoin price had hit $108,075.
Over 100K.
Over 100K. And the market sentiment described was strongly bullish. It registered a score of 74 on the Fear and Greed Index, which puts it firmly in the greed category.
Okay. And just circling back quickly to that global theme, did they reinforce the idea of financial inclusion again at the end?
Yes, the sources did loop back to that briefly, linking it again to the discussions around adoption in Africa and Asia, seeing those as key regions where Bitcoin is potentially enabling greater financial inclusion.
So looking ahead then, how did the sources kind of summarize Bitcoin's role based on everything that happened at the conference?
The sources basically concluded that the conference really solidified Bitcoin's position. They called it a pillar of future finance.
A pillar of future finance.
Yeah, driven by that intense focus on tech innovation, the frankly surprising level of political support, and the increasing institutional adoption they saw everywhere.
And they're already planning the next one, right?
That's right. They noted Bitcoin Conference 2026 is already on the books, April 27th to 29th. back in Las Vegas. And the stated goal is just to keep pushing towards that idea of hyper-Bitcoinization.
So, I mean, based on everything in these sources you share, the political presence, the huge corporate moves, the tech focus, the global outlook,
Yeah.
it really sounds like this conference was, maybe as the sources put it, actually a historic moment.
It certainly seems to have been framed as a powerful catalyst in the reporting, yeah.
Mm.
Reinforcing confidence in where Bitcoin is heading. The sources suggest it really laid significant groundwork for broader and maybe just as importantly, more regulated adoption. With the kind of backing highlighted from, prominent political and business leaders, the picture painted is definitely one of Bitcoin trying to firmly establish itself as a, well, transformative force in global finance.
Powerful insights, and all straight from the source material you provided. And, here's maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on, building on these themes. Given this really strong emphasis we saw in the sources on institutional adoption and government interest in treating Bitcoin as a strategic asset, even setting up reserves, what might this big push towards mainstream regulated acceptance actually mean for that original, decentralized grassroots ethos often associated with Bitcoin? How might that inherent tension play out as this idea of hyper-Bitcoinization possibly unfolds?
That's That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-dollar question now. That tension is absolutely at the heart of so many discussions about Bitcoin's future path. The sources here really highlight that momentum towards mainstream integration, and it definitely leaves that question hanging. How does that mesh with the core principles it all started with? Something really crucial to watch.
Definitely something to watch. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this helps unpack the key takeaways from the Bitcoin Conference 2025 for you, directly from the sources that were shared with us.